At my daughter's wedding reception, she stood in front of 250 guests and accused me of stealing the money I had saved for her wedding. She called me greedy, bitter, and jealous because I refused to admit the truth. Then the ballroom doors opened and the bank manager walked in, holding a folder that made my daughter's face turn white. My name is Marilyn Grace Whitaker. I'm 58 years old and I live in Savannah, Georgia. For most of my adult life, people knew me as the woman who could make a difficult day run smoothly. I owned a small but successful event planning company called Grace Harbor Events, and I had built it from a spare bedroom, a folding table, and a phone that rang only when I begged people to take a chance on me. By the time my daughter Brianna got engaged, I had planned courthouse weddings, black tie galas, charity dinners, and funeral receptions where grieving families trusted me to handle every detail without asking twice. But nothing I had ever planned mattered to me as much as my daughter's wedding. Brianna was my only child. Her father, Robert, had died 6 years earlier after a short fight with pancreatic cancer. Before he passed, he held my hand in his hospital room and whispered, "Make sure she never feels alone." I promised him I would. I did not know then how heavy that promise would become. After Robert died, Brianna changed. She was 23 at the time, old enough to understand death, but young enough to believe life had personally betrayed her. She became sharper with me, colder in public and harder to reach. I gave her space because grief does strange things to people. I told myself she would soften with time. So when she called me one spring morning and said, "Mom, Evan proposed," I cried before she finished the sentence. Evan Cole was polite, handsome, and confident in the way young men can be when the world has not humbled them enough yet. He called me Mrs. Whitaker, even after I asked him to call me Marilyn. He opened doors, smiled easily, and knew how to make people feel seen. Brianna looked happy beside him, and for a while, that was enough for me. Years before, Robert and I had started a wedding fund for Brianna. It was never meant to buy love or control her choices. It was just something two parents built slowly because they wanted their daughter to have one beautiful day without starting married life under a mountain of bills. After Robert died, I kept adding to it. Every deposit felt like a quiet conversation with him. When Brianna began planning, I told her the fund was there, but I would manage payments directly. That was how I handled money in my business. Vendors got paid by invoice. Deposits were tracked. Refunds were documented. Nothing passed through random hands. At first, Brianna seemed grateful. She hugged me in my kitchen and said, "Dad would have loved this." I smiled, but my throat tightened. "He would have loved seeing you happy." For the first few weeks, everything felt almost normal. We visited the venue together, a beautiful restored ballroom near the historic district. We looked at flowers, tasted cake, and argued gently over table linens. I wanted ivory. Brianna wanted champagne. She won, and I let her, because it was her day. But small things started to bother me. When vendors mentioned balances, Brianna looked away. When I asked Evan about his side of the guest list, he gave vague answers. Once, during a meeting with the caterer, his phone buzzed 3 times in a row. He stepped outside, and when he came back, his smile was still there, but his face had lost color. I noticed because noticing details was my job. Still, I said nothing. A wedding brings stress. Families get tense. People act differently when money is involved. What I did not know then was that my daughter had already begun building a lie around me. And by the time I understood it, she would be standing in a white gown under golden lights, turning every face in that ballroom against me. 8 weeks before the wedding, Brianna and I met at my office to go over the final vendor list. Grace Harbor Events was inside a renovated brick building near downtown Savannah, with tall windows, old pine floors, and shelves full of sample books. Usually, brides walked in, nervous and left relieved. That day, my own daughter walked in like she was already tired of me. She sat across from my desk, scrolling through her phone while I reviewed the payments. The venue deposit was settled. The florist had received half. The photographer was confirmed. The caterer needed the second payment by Friday. I'll take care of it, I said. Brianna looked up quickly. You don't have to control every single thing, Mom. I paused with my pen in my hand. I'm not controlling it. I'm paying the invoices directly so there's a clean record. She gave a small laugh, but it had no warmth. Right, because nobody else can be trusted. That sentence stayed with me. A few minutes later, Evan arrived wearing a navy blazer and the easy smile he seemed to carry like a business card. He kissed Brianna on the temple, shook my hand, and said, Ladies, how are we doing? We're fine, Brianna said before I could answer. I watched him glance at the spreadsheet on my desk. It was quick, but not casual. His eyes moved straight to the balances. Then his phone buzzed and he turned it face down almost too fast. Everything all right? I asked. Work stuff, he said. Nothing exciting. I had planned enough corporate events to know when a man was hiding panic behind charm. Over the next 2 weeks, the cracks grew wider. Brianna stopped inviting me to small appointments. I found out from the florist that she had changed the centerpiece design without telling me. When I called her, she said, It's my wedding, Mom. I don't need permission. You don't need permission, I said calmly. But if the price changes, I need the invoice. She sighed like I was embarrassing her. There you go again. At dinner one night, I tried to talk to her privately. We sat on my back porch where the air smelled like jasmine and the oak trees shaded the yard Robert had loved. I made chicken salad, her favorite from childhood, but she barely touched it. Brianna, I said, are you worried about something? She kept her eyes on her glass. No. Is Evan worried about money? Her head snapped up. Why would you say that? Because I've noticed he seems tense when payments come up. She pushed her chair back a little. You always do this. You look for problems. I look for patterns, I said. There's a difference. Her mouth tightened. Maybe the pattern is that you don't trust the man I'm marrying. That hurt more than I let show. I folded my napkin slowly because I needed something to do with my hands. I trust you to choose your life. I just want you protected. I'm not a little girl anymore. No, I said softly. You're not. After she left that night, I stood in the kitchen and looked at the framed photo of Robert near the coffee maker. He was holding Brianna at age 7, both of them laughing, both covered in flour from a birthday cake that had collapsed in the oven. I wondered what he would have said if he had seen the way she looked at me now, as if I were an obstacle instead of her mother. The next morning, I received a call from the caterer. Marilyn, she said carefully, I just wanted to confirm whether Brianna is handling the next payment herself. I frowned. No, why? She mentioned she might be moving some funds around and asked if we could wait. My chest went still. I thanked her, hung up, and opened my payment folder. The money was there. The invoice was there. Nothing had changed on my end, but someone was already telling vendors a different story, and that was the first moment I understood this was not wedding stress anymore. The morning after the caterer called, I arrived at my office before sunrise. Savannah was still quiet, and the streets were nearly empty except for delivery trucks and a few people walking their dogs. I unlocked the front door, turned on the lights, and made myself a cup of coffee before opening my laptop. I had barely taken my first sip when my phone vibrated. Security alert. An attempted transfer from your wedding fund account has been declined. If this was not authorized by you, please contact your bank immediately. I read the message twice, then a third time. My heartbeat stayed steady, but my mind immediately began sorting through possibilities. Banks sometimes sent alerts by mistake. Online systems occasionally flagged normal activity. There could be a simple explanation. Still, I had spent decades running a business. Experience had taught me one rule that had never failed me: never ignore a financial warning. I logged into the account. The balance looked normal. The attempted transfer, however, was sitting in the activity log. Someone had tried to move $48,000 from the wedding fund into another account. The request had failed because the authorization process had detected unusual activity. I stared at the screen for several seconds before picking up my phone and calling Brianna. She answered on the fourth ring. "Morning," she said. "Good morning. Are you busy?" "Just getting ready for work." I received a security alert from the wedding account. There was a pause. What kind of alert? Someone attempted a transfer. Another pause. Then she laughed. "Oh, that's probably just some weird bank error. It says someone tried to authorize a transfer. I'm sure they'll fix it." Brianna. "What? Did you try to move any money?" "No." Her answer came quickly. Too quickly. "I haven't even looked at that account." "I see. You don't believe me?" "I didn't say that." "You always sound like you're questioning me." "I'm asking a simple question." She let out a long breath. "Mom, honestly, banks mess things up all the time. You're worrying over nothing." Maybe she was right. Maybe she wasn't. "I'll call the bank." "Fine." She ended the call without saying goodbye. That bothered me more than the alert itself. Brianna had never liked being questioned, but she usually tried to smooth things over afterward. This time she hadn't. I called the bank's customer service department. After verifying my identity, the representative confirmed that the transfer request had been blocked by their fraud detection system. "Can you tell me where the request originated?" I asked. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitaker. I can't see that information from here." "So someone definitely tried?" "Yes, ma'am." "Was my password compromised?" "It doesn't appear so." "What should I do?" "I recommend visiting your branch today." "I'll be there within the hour." I ended the call and closed my laptop. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't going to solve it over the phone. The bank branch sat less than 15 minutes from my office. The same branch had handled my business accounts for nearly 20 years. As I walked through the lobby, several employees smiled and greeted me by name. I smiled back, but my attention stayed on the matter that had brought me there. The receptionist asked if I had an appointment. "I'd like to speak with whoever handles account security." She nodded. "I'll see who's available." A few minutes later, she returned. "Mr. Thomas Reed can meet with you shortly." I recognized the name. Thomas had managed several business accounts for local companies over the years. Professional, quiet, never dramatic. While I waited, I thought about the timeline. The caterer had called yesterday. Today, there was an attempted transfer. Those two things might have been unrelated, but experience told me not to dismiss patterns simply because I wished they weren't connected. Thomas Reed appeared in the lobby wearing a gray suit and carrying a tablet. "Mrs. Whitaker." "Thomas." He shook my hand. "What can I help you with today?" "I received a fraud alert involving my daughter's wedding fund." His expression changed immediately. Not alarm. Recognition. He led me into a private office and closed the door. "Let's take a careful look," he said. As he opened my account records on his screen, I noticed something that experienced business owners learn to recognize. Thomas wasn't surprised that I had come. It almost looked like he had been expecting me. Thomas Reed turned his monitor slightly so we could both see it. "I can confirm there was an attempted transfer," he said, in the same calm tone he always used. "The system stopped it before any money left the account." "Do you know who initiated it?" He folded his hands on the desk. "At this stage, I can only confirm that the request failed and is under review. I can't make accusations without completing our internal process." I nodded. "I understand." He looked directly at me. "For now, I recommend changing every password connected to this account. Also, don't discuss this with anyone until we know more." His advice surprised me. "Why not?" "Because if someone is testing your account, they may change their behavior once they realize you're investigating." That made perfect sense. I thanked him, updated my security information before leaving the branch, and drove back to my office. The entire way home, one question kept circling through my mind. If Brianna hadn't tried to access the money, then who had? I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. I truly did. 3 days later, Brianna's bridal shower was held at a waterfront restaurant overlooking the Savannah River. I had reserved the private room months earlier, paid the deposit myself, and even arranged the floral centerpieces through one of my favorite vendors. When I walked in carrying a wrapped gift, several relatives greeted me warmly. Denise, my older sister, was already there. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Well," she said loudly, "look who's finally here." "I wasn't late," I answered pleasantly. "No," she replied, "just busy managing everybody's money." A few women laughed awkwardly. I ignored the comment and hugged Brianna. She returned the hug, but only for a second. "You look beautiful," I told her. "Thanks." She immediately turned to greet another guest. The distance between us felt wider than the room itself. Lunch went smoothly at first. People shared stories, opened gifts, and laughed about wedding disasters they had witnessed over the years. Then Denise stood up with her glass. "I'd like to make a little toast." Everyone turned toward her. "To Brianna," she said with a smile. "You've planned such a beautiful wedding despite all the challenges." Brianna lowered her eyes. Someone asked, "What challenges?" Denise sighed dramatically. "Oh, you know how families are." I felt a knot form in my stomach. She continued before anyone could change the subject. "Sometimes parents have trouble letting go." Several guests glanced at me. Denise looked directly in my direction. "Some mothers think paying the bills means they should control every decision." The room became noticeably quieter. I opened my mouth to respond, but Brianna spoke first. "She means well," Brianna said softly. "Mom just likes everything done her way." There it was, not an outright accusation, just enough to plant doubt. A cousin sitting across from me frowned. "Marilyn, is everything okay?" "Everything is fine," I answered calmly. Before I could say another word, Denise shook her head. "You're stronger than I would be, Brianna. I'd hate feeling like my own wedding wasn't really mine." I looked at my sister. "Denise," I said evenly, "this isn't the time." She raised both hands. I didn't mean anything by it. But she absolutely had. The conversation slowly restarted, yet I could feel people watching me differently. Not with anger, with curiosity. That was somehow worse. As dessert was served, I stepped outside onto the balcony overlooking the river. The warm breeze usually calmed me. Not that afternoon. A few minutes later, Brianna joined me. She folded her arms. "You embarrassed Aunt Denise." I stared at her. "I embarrassed her?" "You corrected her in front of everyone. She implied I was controlling you." "She wasn't entirely wrong." I took a slow breath. "Brianna, I've never stopped you from making a single wedding decision. You insist on paying every invoice yourself. Yes, that's how the fund has always worked." She looked away toward the water. "People are starting to wonder why. That doesn't concern me. It concerns me." I studied her face. She wasn't angry. She looked nervous, as though she was afraid someone might ask the wrong question. "I've trusted you with this wedding from the beginning," I said quietly. "Have you?" "Yes." "Sometimes," she replied, "it doesn't feel like trust." Before I could answer, she walked back inside. I remained on the balcony for another minute, watching tour boats move slowly across the river. Something had shifted. This wasn't simply a disagreement between a mother and daughter anymore. Someone was carefully shaping a story about me, and judging by the looks I had just received, people were beginning to believe it. The week after the bridal shower, my office phone rang almost every day. At first, I assumed it was normal wedding business. As the ceremony got closer, vendors usually called with final confirmations, delivery schedules, and seating updates. Instead, each conversation left me with another piece of a puzzle I didn't yet understand. The florist called first. "Marilyn, I wanted to make sure you received the refund." I frowned. "What refund?" "The adjustment for the centerpiece changes. Brianna selected smaller arrangements, so we credited the difference." I opened my payment folder. "I haven't received anything." There was a brief silence. Our records show the refund was already processed. To which account? I'm sorry, she replied. I can't disclose banking information over the phone, but the request came from someone authorized on the order. After hanging up, I stared at the vendor file. Every invoice in my records was complete. Every payment I had made matched my bookkeeping, but somehow a refund had gone somewhere else. That afternoon, I called the photographer. His answer unsettled me even more. Brianna asked if we could delay the final payment for another 2 weeks. I never approved that. I assumed the two of you had discussed it. We hadn't. He apologized immediately, but I assured him none of this was his fault. By the end of the day, I had spoken with 4 vendors. Each conversation revealed a different version of the same story. Someone was contacting them behind my back. Someone was changing instructions. Someone was making it appear that I was causing the delays. I drove home exhausted and spread every wedding document across my dining room table. Robert had built that table himself nearly 30 years earlier. It had been the center of birthdays, Thanksgiving dinners, homework sessions, and family game nights. Now it was covered with invoices, contracts, payment confirmations, and handwritten notes. I highlighted every unexplained change: refund, delayed payment, vendor instruction, changed contact information. By midnight, a pattern had become impossible to ignore. These weren't random mistakes. Someone was quietly moving pieces without expecting me to compare them all together. The next morning, I received another surprise. One of my longtime business clients called to postpone an event because she had heard I was too busy dealing with family financial problems. I nearly dropped the phone. What do you mean? She hesitated. I probably shouldn't say, please. I heard your daughter's wedding is falling apart because money disappeared. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Rumors had escaped the family. Someone wanted my professional reputation damaged, along with my personal one. After thanking her for her honesty, I ended the call and sat quietly in my office. Grace Harbor events depended on trust. If clients believed I mishandled money, even in my own family, they might never hire me again. That afternoon, another unexpected piece of information arrived. An accountant I occasionally worked with mentioned seeing Evan at a networking luncheon. He looked stressed, the accountant said casually. Someone mentioned he lost a fortune in a restaurant investment last year. I tried not to react. A restaurant? Yeah, apparently it closed after less than a year. Tough situation. When the conversation ended, I searched public business records. The information matched. Evan had invested heavily in a small restaurant outside Savannah. The business had failed. Several business filings showed outstanding financial obligations connected to the company. I leaned back in my chair. The unpaid vendors, the attempted transfer, the missing refund, the debt. Separately, each fact meant very little. Together, they painted a troubling picture. Late that evening, I reviewed the florist's paperwork one more time. Hidden among several email attachments was a transaction confirmation I had overlooked. The refund request had not been sent to my business email. It had been redirected to another address listed as an alternate contact. That address belonged to Brianna. I closed my eyes for a long moment. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was heartbroken. Because for the first time, I could no longer convince myself that my daughter was simply overwhelmed by wedding stress. She had redirected money that was never supposed to pass through her hands. And suddenly, I realized something even more disturbing. If Brianna had done this herself, she was making terrible decisions. But if someone had convinced her to do it, then she wasn't acting alone. The next morning, I called Thomas Reed and asked if he had time to meet again. "Come by this afternoon," he said. "I think we need to talk in person." There was something different in his voice this time. It was still professional, but more serious than before. I arrived at the bank just after 2 o'clock. Thomas greeted me in the lobby and led me into the same private office we had used during my first visit. Before sitting down, he closed the blinds on the glass window facing the hallway. "I've completed part of the internal review," he said. I placed my notebook on the table. What did you find? Thomas opened a folder and carefully removed several documents. I need to be clear about something. I can't accuse anyone of a crime. That's not my role. I understand. But I can explain what happened inside the bank. He slid the first document toward me. It was a copy of the failed transfer request. Near the bottom was a signature that was supposed to be mine. I stared at it for several seconds. That isn't my signature. I know. It isn't even close. Thomas nodded. Our handwriting specialists reached the same conclusion. I felt a chill run through me. So someone forged it. Yes, he placed another document beside the first. This authorization form was presented in person. In person? Yes. So whoever did this actually came into the bank. They did. I looked up at him. Do your security cameras show who it was? Thomas hesitated before answering. The footage is being preserved. That means yes. It means the footage exists. His careful wording told me everything I needed to know. The evidence was real. He simply couldn't release it without following bank policy. What happens next? I asked. If law enforcement becomes involved, the footage can be provided through the proper legal process. I took a slow breath and forced myself to stay calm. Years of running a business had taught me that panic rarely solved anything. Facts did. Thomas continued. There was another detail I thought you should know. I looked at him. The person presenting the paperwork wasn't alone. My heart skipped. What do you mean? They entered the branch with someone else. Can you identify either person? I can't. His answer was expected. His expression, however, wasn't. He looked genuinely disappointed that he couldn't tell me more. Marilyn, he said quietly, I've known you for nearly 20 years. I met his eyes. You've always handled your accounts carefully. I try. I've never seen activity on your accounts that raised concerns before this. I appreciated that he was speaking as someone who knew my financial history rather than simply as a banker. There is one more thing, he continued. The attempted transfer wasn't random. What do you mean? It targeted almost the entire available balance. I looked back at the paperwork. Whoever had planned this wasn't testing the account. They intended to empty it. When our meeting ended, Thomas handed me copies of every document he was legally allowed to release. These may be useful if your attorney requests additional records later. My attorney? He gave a small nod. I think you should speak with one. I left the bank carrying a folder that suddenly felt much heavier than paper should. Instead of driving back to my office, I headed directly to Caroline Brooks' law office. Caroline had handled contracts and business matters for Grace Harbor Events for years. She was practical, direct, and never wasted words. After reading through the documents, she leaned back in her chair. You've been protecting everyone except yourself. I don't want this to become a public fight. You may not have that choice anymore. I told her about the rumors, the unpaid vendors, the redirected refund, and Brianna's behavior at the bridal shower. Caroline listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands. Here's my advice. I waited. Don't confront Brianna. That feels wrong. It may feel wrong, she replied, but it's smart. Why? Because if someone forged financial documents once, they'll destroy evidence if they realize you're putting the pieces together. I looked down at the folder Thomas had given me. Caroline was right. Emotion wanted answers immediately. Evidence required patience. As I prepared to leave, my phone vibrated with a new message from Brianna. Mom, we need to talk about the wedding money, not over the phone. I stared at the screen. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, my daughter was asking to discuss the money herself. The question was no longer whether she knew something. It was how much she was willing to admit. I didn't answer Brianna's text immediately. Instead, I drove home, made myself a cup of tea, and sat in the same chair where Robert and I used to end every evening talking about our day. I read Brianna's message 3 more times before replying. "We can meet tomorrow morning," she answered almost instantly. "Okay." My apartment, 10 o'clock. The next morning, I arrived exactly on time. Brianna opened the door wearing sweatpants and one of Evan's oversized sweatshirts. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and half-packed wedding decorations covered the living room. For a moment, I saw the little girl who used to run into my arms after school. Then she crossed her arms. "We need to settle this," she said. "I agree." She remained standing while I sat on the couch. "I know you've been talking to the bank." I didn't react. "I've been protecting the wedding fund," I said calmly. Her jaw tightened. "People are saying you're telling everyone I can't manage my own money. I haven't discussed this with anyone except the bank and my attorney." "My attorney." She repeated the words with a bitter laugh. "So you've hired a lawyer against your own daughter." "I hired a lawyer to protect the truth." She looked away. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she asked, "Do you think I stole from you?" I chose my words carefully. "I think money connected to the wedding has moved in ways I didn't authorize." "That's not what I asked." "No." "What do you think?" I met her eyes. "I think someone is lying." Her face hardened. "Maybe you're the one lying." The words hurt, but I refused to answer with anger. "If that's what you believe," I said quietly, "then I can't change your mind today." She picked up her purse. "I have errands." "So do I." I stood and walked toward the door. Just before I reached it, I turned back. "Brianna." She didn't answer. "I love you." She stared at the floor. I left without hearing those words in return. Outside, I sat in my car for nearly 5 minutes before starting the engine. Caroline had been right. Someone had already decided what story they wanted people to believe. Arguing wasn't going to change it. Evidence would. Over the next several days, I quietly prepared. Every legitimate invoice still owed for the wedding was paid directly by me. I called each vendor personally, confirmed the balance, and sent payment from the wedding fund myself. No checks passed through Brianna or Evan. The venue manager thanked me. I was worried we'd have to cancel services. "There won't be any cancellations," I assured her. I also organized every document into chronological order: bank alerts, payment confirmations, vendor emails, refund records, copies of the forged authorization, phone logs, text messages. By the end of the week, everything fit neatly inside 2 binders. One stayed with Caroline, the other remained locked in my office safe. 3 days before the wedding, Thomas Reed called. "I wanted to update you," he said. "I'm listening." "Our compliance department has finalized its report." "And?" "If false statements are made publicly claiming the bank mishandled funds or that you stole money from the account, I'm authorized to appear and clarify the account history." I was silent for a moment. "You'd actually come?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because facts matter." I thanked him before ending the call. Then I phoned Caroline. She wasn't surprised. "This is exactly why we waited," she said. "If they stay quiet, nothing happens." "And if they don't?" She closed the file she had been reading. "Then we let the evidence speak." Wedding day arrived with clear skies over Savannah. The ballroom looked beautiful. Ivory candles glowed across every table. White roses and soft greenery framed the dance floor. The musicians played quietly while guests admired the decorations. Ironically, it was one of the nicest receptions my company had ever helped organize. I greeted relatives politely. I congratulated Brianna after the ceremony. I even smiled for a few family photographs. No one looking at those pictures would have guessed I was carrying 2 months' worth of evidence in a leather portfolio resting beside my chair. Caroline arrived shortly before dinner and sat at a table near the back of the ballroom. A few minutes later, Thomas Reed entered through a side door, carrying a slim black folder. He caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small nod. I nodded back. Whatever happened next would no longer depend on rumors, assumptions, or emotion. It would depend on the truth. And I had a feeling the truth was about to be tested in front of everyone we knew. Dinner had just ended when Brianna stood and gently tapped a spoon against her champagne glass. The conversations faded. Nearly every guest turned toward the sweetheart table. She smiled at Evan before lifting the microphone. "I want to thank everyone for being here," she began. "This day means everything to us." The room filled with warm applause. Then she looked directly at me. "But there's something I can't celebrate without telling the truth." A heavy silence settled over the ballroom. "My mother has spent months pretending to help us," Brianna said. "The reality is that she stole money from my wedding fund and tried to make everyone believe we were irresponsible." Several guests gasped. I heard someone whisper my name. Brianna continued before anyone could react. "She controlled every payment because she never wanted me to have anything that wasn't on her terms." Denise stood first. "I've watched Marilyn use money to control people for years," she declared loudly. Lydia quickly added, "My son has been blamed for problems he didn't create. This family deserves honesty today." Dozens of eyes shifted toward me. Some looked confused. Others looked disappointed. A few looked angry. I slowly stood from my chair. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I simply said, "Is everyone finished?" No one answered. At that exact moment, the ballroom doors opened. Thomas Reed walked inside carrying the black folder I had seen earlier. Caroline Brooks followed beside him. The room became completely silent. Thomas stopped a few feet from the head table. "My name is Thomas Reed," he said calmly. "I'm the branch manager responsible for the wedding fund account being discussed." Brianna's face lost its color. Thomas opened the folder. "The bank has completed its review of this account. Mrs. Marilyn Whitaker did not remove money from the wedding fund." He placed several certified documents on the table. "Our investigation found multiple unauthorized attempts to transfer funds using forged authorization forms." Guests leaned forward. Thomas continued. "The account owner reported the suspicious activity immediately. The transfer was blocked by our fraud detection system before any money left the account." Caroline stepped beside him. She placed copies of vendor records, refund documents, and payment confirmations next to the bank records. "These documents show every legitimate wedding payment made directly by Mrs. Whitaker," she said. "They also show that one vendor refund was redirected without Mrs. Whitaker's authorization." Brianna looked at Evan. Evan looked at the floor. Thomas spoke again. "The bank also preserved security footage connected to the forged authorization request." Before anyone said another word, Evan quietly muttered, "This wasn't supposed to happen." The microphone near the head table picked up every word. Brianna turned toward him in disbelief. "What did you just say?" He rubbed both hands over his face. "I told you we'd fix it before your mom found out." The room erupted with shocked whispers. No one needed another explanation. The truth had finally reached everyone at the same moment. The ballroom fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Moments earlier, people had been judging me. Now they were trying to understand how everything had unraveled so quickly. Brianna stared at Evan as though she had never seen him before. "You said nobody would ever know," she whispered. He didn't answer. Caroline stepped forward before emotions could take over. "I think this reception should end here," she said calmly. "The evidence has been presented, and any remaining issues need to be handled through the proper legal process." Thomas nodded in agreement. "The bank has already documented the attempted fraud and preserved all related records. We will cooperate fully with any investigation." No one argued. There was nothing left to argue about. Brianna slowly sat down, still holding the microphone. Tears rolled down her face, but she made no attempt to wipe them away. Denise looked around the room, searching for someone to support her, yet every relative avoided her eyes. Lydia quietly walked to Evan's side. "What were you thinking?" she asked under her breath. Evan shook his head. "I thought I could replace the money before anyone noticed." "And when you couldn't?" He closed his eyes. I panicked. Brianna looked at him with disbelief. "You told me this was only temporary." I believed it was. "You asked me to redirect the refund." "I know. You told me my mom would never notice." He had no answer. For the first time since Robert's death, I saw my daughter not as an angry woman blaming everyone else, but as someone finally facing the consequences of her own choices. She had made those choices herself. No one had forced her. But she had trusted the wrong person and convinced herself that blaming me was the easiest escape. Within an hour, most of the guests had quietly left the reception. A few relatives stopped to apologize. "I shouldn't have believed the rumors," one cousin admitted. "I owe you an apology," another said. I thanked them, but I didn't feel victorious. Winning the truth had cost more than I ever wanted to pay. Over the following days, Caroline helped me provide every document requested by the authorities. The matter was handled professionally. A formal report was filed regarding the attempted fraud and the forged authorization documents. The bank continued its cooperation, and Thomas remained available whenever additional records were needed. I refused to ask anyone for special treatment. The law would take its course. Grace Harbor events survived because my clients saw exactly what had happened. Several even called to tell me they admired the way I had stayed calm instead of fighting rumors with more rumors. One client said something I never forgot. "Your reputation wasn't saved by the evidence," she told me. "It was saved by the way you carried yourself before the evidence appeared." A week after the wedding, someone knocked on my front door. When I opened it, Brianna was standing there alone. She looked exhausted. There was no makeup hiding the sleepless nights, no wedding dress, no carefully rehearsed confidence, just my daughter. "I know you probably don't want to see me," she said quietly. I stepped aside. "You can come in." She sat at the same kitchen table where Robert had once helped her with math homework and where we had celebrated birthdays for years. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked at me. "I kept telling myself that if everyone believed you took the money, no one would ask where it really went." I nodded slowly. "I know. I was ashamed. I know. I blamed you because it was easier than admitting I made terrible decisions." There were tears in both our eyes now. She reached across the table but stopped before touching my hand. "Can you ever forgive me?" I took a long breath before answering. "I will always love you because you're my daughter, but love and trust are not the same thing." She lowered her head. "You'll have to earn the trust back." "I understand. And that won't happen in one conversation." "I know." For the first time in months, we were finally telling each other the truth. When she left that afternoon, I stood on my front porch and watched her drive away. I didn't know what the future would hold for her marriage or for our relationship. What I did know was this: peace isn't pretending. Betrayal never happened. Peace is refusing to let betrayal define the rest of your life. Robert had asked me to make sure our daughter never felt alone. I had kept that promise the best I could, but I also learned something he never had the chance to tell me. Sometimes the greatest act of love is setting firm boundaries, protecting your good name, and leaving the door open only for the truth. If there's one thing this story reminds me of, it's that the truth doesn't always speak first, but when it finally does, it has a way of changing everything. Trust is one of the most valuable things a family can share, and once it's broken, rebuilding it takes far more than an apology. I'd really like to hear what you think. If you were in Marilyn's place, would you have forgiven your daughter, or would you have walked away for good? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every perspective tells a different story. If this story moved you, consider giving it a like. And if you enjoy emotional family drama, betrayal, justice, and unforgettable revenge stories like this one, subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Until next time, remember, your good name is worth protecting, even when it costs you the people you love.